The year was 1119. The air in Jerusalem still carried the scent of blood and incense. The First Crusade, that brutal, blazing tide of steel and scripture, had ended only 2 decades earlier. The Christian armies, ragged, zealous, half-starved, had somehow taken the holy city. They claimed it was the will of God, but the land remained wild, fractured, dangerous. Jerusalem, though now under Christian rule, was an island of uneasy faith surrounded by seas of unrest. The surrounding roads teemed with danger: raiders, desert tribes, dispossessed warriors, even some crusaders who had turned from piety to plunder. Thousands of pilgrims had begun pouring in from across Europe: peasants, nobles, widows, and monks, all seeking to walk in the footsteps of Christ. They brought nothing but coin, prayers, and blind devotion, and many of them never made it. Some were robbed, others were sold into slavery, some simply vanished into the hills. The road to salvation had become a death march. Amid this chaos, a French knight named Hugues de Payens looked out across the city and saw more than ruins or relics. He saw a mission, a calling. Hugues was no king, no pope, no prophet, just a knight, seasoned, devout, disillusioned perhaps, but determined. Alongside 8 fellow knights, he made a vow: not to glory, not to conquest, but to protection. Protection of the pilgrims. They formed a brotherhood, half monks, half warriors. They renounced wealth, renounced women, renounced the world. They took vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and they called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The name was long. The world would shorten it soon enough: the Knights Templar. Their quarters were humble. They lived atop the ruins of what was believed to be Solomon's temple, hence the name. The site was sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. The symbolism wasn't lost on them. They were reclaiming not just land, but legacy. These early Templars were so poor, they reportedly rode 2 to a horse. Their banner showed just that: 2 knights on a single steed. But even then, they understood something powerful. They could weaponize faith. They weren't mercenaries. They weren't lords. They were God's soldiers. Word of their mission spread across Europe, reaching the ears of one of the most influential voices of the time, Bernard of Clairvaux, a monk, a mystic, a man with the ear of kings and popes. Bernard saw the Templars as a new kind of holy warrior, one untainted by politics or greed. In them, he saw purity, simplicity, purpose. He preached their cause, wrote glowing letters. He called them Knights of Christ. In 1129, largely thanks to his influence, the Templars were formally recognized by the Council of Troy. They received the Church's full blessing and the backing of the Pope. Suddenly, these obscure knights were no longer fringe defenders of the faith. They were a papally endorsed military order with a mission blessed by heaven itself. And then came the donations: lands, castles, gold. Entire estates were turned over to the Templars by nobles who saw spiritual profit in such gifts. Peasants began referring to them in the same breath as saints. Families offered up their sons to join the cause. But the Templars remained austere. They dressed in white, the color of purity, with a stark red cross emblazoned on their chest. It was not just a symbol, it was a statement. They were ready to die for their God, and they often did. In battle, they became legendary. When other knights broke ranks, the Templars held the line. They rode in formation, shields tight, lances leveled. They were said to fear nothing, neither blade nor fire. Their rules forbade retreat unless outnumbered 3 to 1, and even then, many refused to flee. The early years were brutal. They bled for Christendom on the sand-swept fields of Outremer, fighting Muslim armies that were larger, faster, and often better equipped. But what the Templars lacked in numbers, they made up for in discipline, and in something else, purpose. They weren't just soldiers, they were monks, and their cause wasn't land or treasure, it was Jerusalem. But the genius of the Templars wasn't only on the battlefield. Behind the scenes, something else was taking shape. Quiet, powerful. They began managing the donations, the land, the estates. They created preceptories, administrative centers scattered across Europe. They learned how to manage wealth discreetly. And over time, they began to do more than just protect pilgrims. They started to finance them. A pilgrim in England could deposit money with the Templars, then receive a coded letter to retrieve funds in the Holy Land. It was revolutionary. They had created one of the first international banking systems. And all of it, every coin, every castle, was protected by the order's status. They answered to no king, only the Pope. In an age where monarchs squabbled over borders and church and crown were often at odds, the Templars became something no one else could be, untouchable. In the space of a single generation, they had risen from 9 poor knights to one of the most powerful forces in the known world. An army, a bank, a brotherhood, a myth. And while the world watched them ride beneath banners of blood and purity, few understood what had truly begun. The forging of an empire, not of lands or crowns, but of faith, secrecy, and steel. By the year 1120, the dusty roads of Jerusalem no longer echoed only with the footsteps of barefoot pilgrims. They rang with the disciplined march of armed men in white mantles, each stitched with a blood-red cross. The original vow of 9 knights to protect travelers had become something far more formidable, the birth of a military brotherhood unlike anything Christendom had ever seen. The Holy Land was not a sanctuary, it was a battleground. The deserts were littered with bones, the roads soaked in blood. Thieves, mercenaries, and ambushes awaited every traveler. The fragile Crusader states, newborn and surrounded by enemies, struggled to maintain their hold. The time for piety alone had passed. The church needed men who could wield both the sword and the scripture. And so the Knights Templar evolved. They embraced the paradox of holy war, monks who fought without fear, warriors bound not to lords or gold, but to divine command. Their white cloaks symbolized purity, their crimson crosses martyrdom. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet they marched in full armor, with shields gleaming and war horses trained for slaughter. They became God's militia. Their transformation was not just military, it was political and spiritual. In 1129, at the Council of Troy, the Templars received formal ecclesiastical approval. With the influence of Bernard of Clairvaux, a towering spiritual figure of the age, The Brotherhood gained not only respect, but sacred legitimacy. Bernard, a master of words and theology, praised them as divine instruments. In his treatise in praise of the new knighthood, he described them as both lambs and lions, protectors of the innocent and scourges of the wicked. The papacy did not hesitate. By 1139, Pope Innocent II issued the bull Omni Datum Optimum, placing the Templars directly under papal authority. No king could tax them, no bishop could command them, no feudal court could summon them. They were sovereign in all but name, an order above all others, and with power came growth. Templar strongholds rose across the Levant, the fortress of Gaza, the mighty citadel at Safed, the impregnable Croix des Chevaliers. These were not merely castles, they were statements, towers of iron and stone, declaring that Christendom would not yield. In Europe, the order became the recipient of lands, wealth, and privilege. Nobles, eager to earn salvation, donated entire estates. Kings gifted them lands in return for blessings and protection. Their holdings stretched from Portugal's valleys to Hungary's plains, from the Scottish highlands to the hills of Cyprus. Templar commanderies managed thousands of acres, operated vineyards, ran mills, and collected rents. But their true power lay in something even more modern: finance. In an age before banks, the Templars created one. Pilgrims could deposit gold in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem. Nobles borrowed money from them. Kings mortgaged their kingdoms to them. The Templars issued letters of credit, pioneered transnational accounting, and guarded the treasures of monarchs in fortified vaults. Their wealth was not used for luxury. They lived modestly, but it became the backbone of their mission. They funded crusades, supplied armies, repaired roads, and fortified passes. And slowly, without conquest or crowns, they became an empire within an empire. By the mid-12th century, the Knights Templar stood at their zenith. They answered to no crown, feared no enemy, held land and coin and sacred trust. But even the mightiest tower can cast a long shadow. Whispers began to grow. Were these knights truly humble servants of God or secret masters of Europe? Did they still fight for the cross or for power? The church began to worry. Had it created a monster? And in the east, storm clouds gathered. Muslim leaders, once fractured by infighting, began to unify. In Aleppo, Zengi forged a new order. His son, Nur ad-Din, continued the crusade. And then came Saladin, noble, devout, and unstoppable. The fall of Edessa in 1144 sent shockwaves across Europe. A second crusade was called. The Templars were at the heart of it, advisors, warriors, commanders. But the campaign ended in failure and disgrace. More defeats followed. The once mighty Crusader states began to fragment. Internal feuds, broken alliances, and mistrust poisoned their cause. And yet, the Templars fought on. They stood as the last wall between Christian outposts and total collapse. Their garrisons often held when others fled. They refused ransom, choosing death over retreat. To surrender was dishonor. To die in battle, a promise fulfilled. But as the Holy Land slipped from Christian hands, the myth of Templar invincibility began to crack. And so too did the patience of those in power. What happens when your most powerful knights no longer serve your needs? What happens when guardians become a threat? What happens when the tide turns? The Knights Templar had risen on faith, fire, and fearlessness, but soon they would be asked to pay for every inch of power they had ever taken, and no sword, no blessing, no fortress could stop what was coming. The year was 1187, and the cross was bleeding. After decades of uneasy truces, broken alliances, and fractured leadership among the Crusader states, the unthinkable happened. Jerusalem, holy city of Christendom, the very jewel of the Crusades, fell. Its conqueror was not a brute, but a legend, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. A Kurdish general turned sultan, he had united Egypt and Syria under one banner of jihad. A devout Muslim and a shrewd commander, Saladin brought with him not only vast armies, but a sense of divine purpose. And where Christian rulers squabbled, he strategized. Where barons betrayed one another, he consolidated power. Where others sought glory, he sought unity. He was everything the Crusaders were not, and he moved with righteous vengeance. But the disaster that led to Jerusalem's fall began far from its walls, on the scorching plains near a hill called Hattin. The Battle of Hattin, July 4th, 1187. It was a massacre. The Christian forces, led by King Guy of Lusignan and supported by both the Templars and their counterparts, the Hospitallers, were drawn into the desert heat as by Saladin's cunning. The wells were poisoned, the grass set alight, the air thick with smoke, and when the Crusaders finally stumbled into formation, they were parched, disoriented, and surrounded. The Templars fought with the same fire they had always known, but it was not enough. Their elite knights were cut down, captured, executed, some by the sword. Others, like Grand Master Gérard de Riedfort, were spared, only to witness the systematic beheading of their brethren. Over 200 Templar knights were slaughtered after the battle. It was not merely a loss, it was an extinction event. Jerusalem, weakened and defenseless, soon fell. And though Saladin spared the Christian population, allowing many to flee or buy their freedom, the psychological blow was catastrophic. The Holy City, the very reason the Templars existed, was no longer in Christian hands. What is a holy warrior without the holy? What is a guardian without something to guard? Across Europe, the news struck like thunder. Cathedrals rang funeral bells. Monarchs gathered in rage and mourning. Pope Gregory VIII called for the Third Crusade, urging kings to take up the cross once more. The Knights Templar, bruised but not broken, answered again. But this time, they would not fight alongside barons and petty lords. This time, they would ride with kings. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and the reluctant Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a campaign of kings and crowns, steel and scripture. Europe's most powerful monarchs swore to reclaim Jerusalem or die trying. And the Templars? They were no longer just warriors. They were advisors, negotiators, quartermasters. Their vast European estates supplied arms, men, and coin. Their war-hardened veterans led battalions into battle. Their castles became supply lines. Their ships carried armies across seas. But the Third Crusade would not reclaim Jerusalem. Richard won great victories at Acre, at Arsuf, but never reached the holy city. Saladin held fast, and though both sides earned grudging respect for one another, no resolution came. Instead, treaties were signed, pilgrims were allowed access, but Jerusalem remained lost, and something changed subtly, quietly. The glory of crusading began to rust. No longer was it a divine fire. It became political, strategic, burdened with taxes, debts, and false promises. And the Knights Templar, once the shining hope of Christendom, began to be seen differently, too powerful, too rich, too distant from the people they claimed to protect. They still fought, they still bled, but their victories no longer stirred songs. Their failures began to breed doubt, and behind closed doors, kings began to whisper, "Do we still need them? Or worse, can we afford them?" Because make no mistake, the Templars were not servants. They were sovereign. Their lands across Europe had only grown. Their coffers rivaled monarchies. Their loyalties lay not with crowns, but with the papacy. And kings who struggled to keep their own barons in line, began to chafe. By the dawn of the 13th century, the Knights Templar stood at a crossroads. They had survived disaster. They had fought with lions. They had held the line against a united enemy. But their golden age was ending. And what comes after glory is envy. And envy has sharp teeth, especially when worn by a crown. By the year 1187, the world as the Templars knew it began to unravel. Jerusalem, the heart of their mission, the soul of the Crusades, the city for which they had spilled oceans of blood, was lost. And it wasn't taken by trickery. It was claimed by power, purpose, and a man whose name would change history. Saladin. To understand the fall of Jerusalem, you must understand the man who took it. Born in Tikrit, raised in the courts of Syria and Egypt, Salah ad-Din was not just a military commander. He was a symbol, a unifier in a fractured Islamic world. Where sultans and emirs had once feuded, Saladin brought cohesion, and with unity came strength. His reputation was not only for victory, but for mercy. Where Crusader knights had butchered Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in 1099, Saladin chose restraint. When the city surrendered to him, he spared lives, allowed Christians to ransom themselves, and ensured no mass executions followed. But this was no sign of weakness. This was control, the kind the Templars feared most. It began at the Horns of Hattin, a hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Under a blazing July sun, Saladin lured the Crusader army into open terrain, away from their water supplies. Among them were knights of the Templar order, proud, disciplined, yet overconfident. Saladin encircled them. He let the heat crush their resolve. He let thirst drive them mad. And then he struck. It was a massacre. Some were killed, others captured. The true cross, the most sacred relic in Christian hands, was seized. The Templar Grand Master, Gerard de Riedfort, survived, though many of his brothers were executed by Saladin's hand the very next day. And then, the march on Jerusalem. Its Christian defenders were few, its supplies drained, its morale shattered. With little resistance, the city fell. The impact was seismic. The world the Templars had built, the foundation of their authority, their mythos, their divine justification, crumbled with the fall of those ancient walls. In Europe, chaos. Panic gripped the courts. Priests wept at the altar. Nobles cried for vengeance. And three kings, among the most powerful men of the age, answered the call. The result? The Third Crusade, a king's war. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Each had their own motives, but one thing united them: reclaiming what had been lost. And in this clash of crowns, the Knights Templar once again became the edge of the spear. They were the logistical backbone of the crusade. They organized supply chains, guarded relics, and led cavalry charges across burning deserts. In Acre, they fought in brutal siege. At Arsuf, they charged alongside Richard's forces, breaking Saladin's line. But this was not like the First Crusade. The wars were longer, colder, full of stalemates and negotiations. Jerusalem remained elusive. Even after victories in the field, the holy city stayed in Muslim hands. Richard lacked the forces to take it. He settled instead for a treaty, a temporary peace that allowed Christian pilgrims to enter, but not reclaim. For the Templars, it was bittersweet. Their hands still held swords. Their banners still flew. But the heart of their purpose, their sacred flame, flickered. And yet, in this new world, they did not fade. They evolved. While the Holy Land became increasingly unstable, the Templars turned their gaze west. Their network of commanderies across Europe grew stronger. Their estates multiplied. Their banking system matured. They became the financial spine of Christendom. From Paris to Lisbon, from London to Rome, they were everywhere. A knight could walk from the Pyrenees to the Danube and sleep in Templar holdings the entire way. And with power came suspicion. Whispers began, not from the battlefields, but from the court. Templars no longer looked like poor warriors of Christ. They wore fine cloaks, dined well, spoke Latin and Arabic, dealt with kings as equals, and most dangerous of all, they had no master but the Pope. They were untouchable by local bishops or kings. They answered to no crown. They were, in a way, their own sovereign order. And sovereignty is always threatening, especially when it comes wrapped in silk and steel. Meanwhile, the Holy Land continued to decay. New Muslim leaders rose, some ruthless, some brilliant. The Crusader states shrank, city by city, fortress by fortress. Even the Templars' greatest citadels, like Croix des Chevaliers and Montfort, began to look vulnerable. Still, they endured. They fought. They bled. They died. But the aura of divine favor that had once cloaked them had dimmed. Europe noticed, and though kings still borrowed from them, and popes still praised them, a question took root in the hearts of men. Were the Templars still holy, or had they become something else, something darker? The stage was set, not in Jerusalem, but in Paris, where a king owed more than coin, and would repay it with fire. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Knights Templar stood at a strange crossroads. They no longer marched through the deserts of the Holy Land. They no longer guarded Jerusalem's gates. That city, once the sacred heart of their mission, was now long lost, a memory burned into crumbling maps and stained altars. But the Templars still thrived. In Europe, they had become something other than crusaders. They were landowners, bankers, shipbuilders, diplomats, power brokers. Their commanderies stretched from the windswept shores of Ireland to the vineyards of Italy. Their treasuries overflowed with gold, relics, titles, and deeds. They no longer needed a sword to wield influence. Their very name was enough. And in France, that name drew the eyes of a king. Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, the French king was no stranger to ambition. His rule was orderly, calculating, and increasingly centralized. He fought wars, he crushed dissent, he expelled the Jews, he taxed the clergy, he feuded with the Pope, and he owed the Templars a fortune. Wars were expensive, diplomacy even more so, and Philip's crown sat heavy upon debts. He had borrowed heavily from the Knights Templar to fund his armies and maintain royal prestige. At first, they were useful, quiet, efficient, but over time they became dangerous, not through rebellion, but through presence. Philip began to resent their wealth, their land, their influence, and most of all, their independence. The Templars answered only to the Pope, not to kings, not to parliaments. They were like a state within a state, immune to royal pressure. Their Paris headquarters sat just miles from Philip's own palace, and yet it felt untouchable, until Philip decided it wouldn't be. He wanted their power, their coin, their disappearance. But to strike at the Templars would not be easy. They were holy warriors, papally sanctioned, guardians of the cross. Any direct attack would provoke outrage. So Philip turned to the most effective weapon a ruler can wield, accusation. And he had help, a man named Guillaume de Nogaret, the king's legal advisor, a master of manipulation and political theater. Together, they crafted a strategy not of war, but of defamation. The charges would be shocking, heretical, blasphemous. They would not accuse the Templars of failure. They would accuse them of sin. And on Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date that would haunt calendars for centuries, the trap was sprung. At dawn, across all of France, Philip's agents arrested every Templar they could find. From senior commanders to humble brothers, they were seized in secret, often without resistance. Their possessions were confiscated, their commanderies raided, their books burned. Their leaders, like Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were taken in chains. And the charges? Heresy, idol worship, sodomy, spitting on the cross, worshiping Baphomet, kissing unholy relics, renouncing Christ, lies, distortions, but powerful nonetheless. Torture followed. The Inquisition, once meant to root out true heresy, was weaponized by the crown. Under pain of fire and iron, many confessed, often retracting their statements once the pain stopped, but by then the damage was done. Europe was shocked. Some believed the accusations, others questioned them. But in a world of fear and faith, proof was less important than perception. Philip presented himself as the righteous sword of God, purging corruption from the Church's most elite order. He urged Pope Clement V, a man who owed his position in part to Philip to disband the Templars entirely. The Pope hesitated, but the pressure mounted, and eventually he relented. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, the Order of the Knights Templar was officially dissolved by papal decree, not condemned, not convicted, simply erased. Their lands were seized, some handed to the rival Knights Hospitaller, others absorbed into royal coffers, their gold vanished, their archives were destroyed or hidden, and their leaders tried, silenced, burned. In 1314, Grand Master Jacques de Molay was led to a pyre on the banks of the Seine in Paris. As the flames licked his robes, he did not beg for mercy. He proclaimed his innocence, and he called upon God himself to judge those who had condemned him. According to legend, he declared, "Before the year ends, both Pope Clement and King Philip will answer to the divine court." Both died within months. Whether divine justice or coincidence, the myth was born. The Templars were no more, but their story of wealth, war, betrayal, and silence was only beginning to echo through time. In the ashes of their fall, a legend was born, one that would whisper through the centuries, into secret societies, into conspiracy, into the bones of history itself. The fires that consumed the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar may have died down, but they never truly went out. For though the order was dissolved, its spirit, its legend, only grew stronger. In the decades that followed, people across Europe whispered questions that the Church never dared answer. Where did the gold go? Did all the knights truly perish? What secrets did they carry into silence? No one could say. And so, legends began to bloom in the absence of truth. Some said that not all Templars were captured in 1307, that a handful had fled, vanishing into the hills of Scotland, sailing from the ports of La Rochelle, or riding into the deep forests of Germany, taking their sacred relics and hidden treasures with them. In Portugal, they were reborn under a new name, the Order of Christ, protected by kings who refused to believe the lies of Philip. In England, their lands passed hands quietly. Some said the knights merely removed their white mantles and waited for the world to remember them rightly. And in the East, in Jerusalem, in the burning bones of the Holy Land, the memory of the Red Cross lingered in stone and dust. But what survived most was the myth. Because the Templars had never been merely soldiers, they had become symbols of divine mission, of sacred knowledge, of power bound by silence. And so the stories spread that the Templars had discovered the Ark of the Covenant beneath the Temple Mount, that they had guarded the Holy Grail, hiding it in secret vaults, protected by coded maps and bloodlines, that they knew secrets of Jesus Christ, never shared with the world, truths that could shatter the foundations of the Church, that they had formed a hidden society, operating in the shadows to shape world events, even to this day. Some said they became the Rosicrucians, others pointed to the Freemasons, their rituals echoing ancient Templar rites. Writers, mystics, revolutionaries, all found meaning in their symbol, a red cross on white, a brotherhood fallen, a truth buried in flame. Centuries passed, the world changed, empires rose and fell, but the Templars remained, not in flesh, but in stories, in novels and scrolls, in paintings and cathedrals, in hidden chambers and coded manuscripts, in the minds of those who seek the sacred in the forgotten. Why? Because the fall of the Knights Templar was not just a moment of history, it was a rupture, a crack in the illusion that power and piety are always aligned. It exposed how fear manipulates faith, how kings fear those who kneel to no crown, how truth can be silenced but never destroyed. Even now, in the modern age, their symbol endures in books, in films, in conspiracy forums and hidden societies, on rings and altars, in video games and documentaries. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Templars is not in what they built or what they lost, but in what they still make us wonder. What did they know? What did they see? And what if their greatest secret has yet to be uncovered? Their order was erased, their lands scattered, their names burned, and yet they remain, etched into time, not merely as warriors or monks, but as a question, a riddle written in red and white, a reminder that history is never finished, and that in every shadow, behind every veil of power and piety, there may yet be a knight watching, waiting, not for war, but for truth.